It had been a few months since the failed rescue mission in Sinister Palace. Officer Benson hated himself for being the sole survivor, but what bothered him the most was that he'd brought an innocent person to a dangerous place. That person's name was Erna. Every night, Officer Benson had nightmares about that day. Among the screams, Erna's was the loudest. This went on for weeks until Officer Benson finally decided to do something. Officer Benson drove to the nearest church to have his bullets blessed. After that, he drove to Sinister Palace without telling a soul. The policeman knew that others would try to stop him if they knew what he was planning. Officer Benson entered the palace, went to the cellar, and approached the old door. His hand hovered near the doorknob, fear and reluctance preventing him from touching it. But then the screams of Erna and his fellow officers echoed in his head. That was enough for the officer to follow through. Officer Benson entered the portal and found himself in a familiar-looking forest. He looked around, hoping to find Erna's stake trail. To his relief, it was still there. Officer Benson guessed that all of the Neurevamps lived in the obsidian temple. If he was right, Officer Benson would kill as many Neurevamps as possible. His gun could only hold so many bullets. Driven by his resolution, Officer Benson followed the stakes. Before reaching his destination, Officer Benson decided to pull out his stake and use it as a last resort should things go south for him. He grabbed a stake, yanked it out of the ground, and hid it in the back of his pants before moving on. Finally, Officer Benson had reached the temple. His heart raced as he approached the temple's doors with his gun ready. His hand trembled as it reached for a handle. Officer Benson pointed his gun forward as he slowly opened the door. The sound of wood grinding against obsidian made him tense. Officer Benson entered the temple when he saw the well-shaped cauldron in the center of the room. This time, it was empty. Officer Benson realized that he had never found out what the potion in that cauldron was meant for. But at the same time, he didn't care as he had more serious matters to focus on. Officer Benson then turned his attention to the three familiar corridors. He remembered that the library was in the left corridor because he had been there with Erna the last time he had visited the temple. That's when it dawned on him that he didn't know what was in the other corridors. Officer Benson believed one of those corridors led to the Neurevamps' resting places. He decided to start by investigating the right corridor. He entered the first room and found nothing but chests. The chests contained herbs and crystals. Officer Benson examined the next room and found more chests full of herbs and crystals. After checking a few more rooms and finding the same thing, the policeman concluded that the whole corridor was storage. With that in mind, he decided to move on to the middle corridor. The middle corridor led to a single door at the end of the hall. As he approached it, Officer Benson noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Thinking the Neurevamps were inside, he readied his gun and cautiously made his way to the end of the hall. He slowly opened the door a little before peering through the crack. He couldn't see any Neurevamps, nor did he hear any signs of someone being in the room. After confirming that nobody was present, Officer Benson entered the room and looked around. The room was full of strange-looking artifacts, some in display cases. Officer Benson explored the room examining every item when something caught his attention. There was a cabinet with its glass door wide open and its key still in its keyhole. Officer Benson suspected that whoever opened the cabinet wasn't supposed to take whatever was inside. Just when he was thinking that, the policeman felt someone grab his shoulder and the back of his head. Officer Benson then felt someone bite down on his neck, causing him to scream in pain. He swung his fist, punching the head a couple of times before his neck was released. Officer Benson pressed a hand against his bleeding wound while aiming his gun at the attacker. Lying on the ground was a female humanoid with a bit of blood smeared on her mouth. Her skin was light gray, and she wore Victorian-style clothing. Officer Benson felt his heart sink when he recognized the entity. It was a Nerovamp. The Nerovamp looked up at him and smiled. Her blood-red eyes stared him down as she got up. "Well, if it isn't Officer Benson," the Nerovamp said. "I didn't think I'd see you back here." Officer Benson froze when he heard the Nerovamp's voice. It sounded familiar to him, but he didn't know why. He looked at her face for a moment when realization dawned on him. No, Officer Benson mumbled as he shook his head. "Erna?" The Nerovamp slowly nodded, confirming the officer's fears. Officer Benson apologized profusely, expressing his guilt for leaving Erna behind that day. Erna chuckled at his words, saying that he did nothing wrong. If anything, he did her a favor by bringing her to the temple. Officer Benson gawked at Erna, trying to make sense of her words. "Oh, and by the way, I'm not Erna anymore," Erna said. "I am Sister Sinister." She confessed that she'd been searching for Sinister Palace for years. Now that she'd found it, Erna, or rather Sister Sinister, could finally achieve her goal. Scared and confused, Officer Benson asked what her goal was. Instead of answering the question, Sister Sinister told him that the world would find out soon enough. But now that Officer Benson knew who she was, she had to kill him. Sister Sinister lunged at Officer Benson, attempting to bite him again, but he dodged just in time before firing at her. Sister Sinister yelled as the bullet hit her in the arm. While the Nerovamp was distracted, Officer Benson made a run for it and tossed his stake. He could hear Sister Sinister running after him, cussing him out in a mix of English and German. Officer Benson was so focused on running and getting away from Sister Sinister that he couldn't remember how or when he got back to the portal. When Officer Benson returned to Sinister Palace, he grabbed a wooden barrel and blocked the door. When he got home, Officer Benson reflected on everything that had happened. On one hand, he was relieved that Erna was still alive, but he couldn't get over the terror he'd felt when he learned that she was turned into a Nerovamp. Officer Benson was left alone with so many questions surrounding what Erna said. Why was she searching for Sinister Palace? What goal was she talking about? And above all, how was Erna content with being a Nerovamp? Try as he might, Officer Benson couldn't make sense of Erna's behavior. Suddenly, he remembered Jenny, the young woman who disappeared months prior. The officer recalled a text she'd sent to her mother. It was something about finding her true home in the world below the palace. After putting two and two together, Officer Benson finally understood what had happened to Jenny. The Nerovamps must have turned Jenny as they did Erna. Another concern Officer Benson had was what would happen if he saw any Nerovamps again. In the beginning, Officer Benson swore to exterminate the Nerovamps, but upon realizing that 2 innocent women were turned into such creatures, he wasn't sure he could do that anymore. Instead, the policeman vowed to find a way to save the Nerovamps. Officer Benson never told anyone he knew about Sister Sinister. The only people who knew the story were those who practiced magic and studied the supernatural. As far as the world's concerned, Erna J. Weissman was no more. Since then, Officer Benson had spent his spare time looking for a way to break the Nerovamp curse.